Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Income inequality, the income gap between the highest paid executives and the lowest paid workers, has never been greater. The issue is more pronounced in California, where there's a yawning economic divide between coastal and inland counties and between rural and urban communities. In fact, in California, one of the most expensive states in the nation, has a workforce where by 2021, 1/3 of the workforce was making $15 an hour or less. A recent survey found that 70% of Californians say the gap between the rich and the poor is only getting larger. Could labor unions that negotiate wages and benefits on behalf of workers be the answer? The majority of Californians seem to think so. 8 in 10 California adults completely or somewhat agree that it's important for workers to organize so employers don't take advantage of them. Our guest is Bedayn, a reporter with CalMatters, who recently did a series of articles on the role of unions in the 21st century. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks for having me.
So how are unions perceived in California generally?
Yeah, it's a good question. In 2020, 65% of the California public approved of unions, which is about 10% below the approval rate of the 1950s when unions were at their peak. But today, unions are still perceived as largely pale, stale, and male. They're associated with old manufacturing jobs that were largely dominated by white men, white working class men in the middle of the last century. And unions still haven't been able to get over the kind of hump and into the 21st century, even though they have a high approval rating.
Yeah, and the workforce obviously is changing, right? It's younger, it's more diverse, and if unions have a reputation of being pale, male, and stale, that's a problem.
Exactly.
So what types of workers are in unions today? Are they predominantly, I assume, a lot in the public sector, private sector quite a bit less, I would assume.
Exactly.
So if someone wanted to form a union, let me ask you this question. They want to form a union. How would they go about doing that?
Unions typically start when workers see problems in their workplace, and whether that's low wages or poor healthcare or bad safety, and they start talking to each other. The workers we spoke to started, talking at work and after work and deciding what they wanted to do about it, and then would often go and get help from a local union that maybe represents workers that they in their similar industry. And then once they get 30% of the workers' signatures saying that they want a union, the National Labor Relations Board confirms that they can go forward with an election. And if a majority of the workers vote for a union, then the union's created, and they can then negotiate a contract that will kind of set the bar for the standards of work.
Yeah, and that 30% is just a rule the NLRB has created before they get involved. But it also says something about unions as well as the NLRB, the government agency, doesn't want to get involved if 2 workers out of 100 want a union. They want to show that there's a substantial number of people that want a union. And I've also heard that the statement said that the best union organizer is a bad manager. And I think that says a lot about why people do form unions. It's typically not a union coming into a workplace, but rather workers themselves getting together and deciding that they want a union to correct the situation. But you hear unions being big labor, or union leaders being union bosses. It kind of sounds kind of threatening and intimidating. But you report that in reality, labor unions, particularly in the private sector, have been declining for years. What are the numbers?
Yeah, in California in the 1950s, at the peak, about 40% of the workers were unionized. And over the last 60, 70 years, that has declined to 14% in 2018, with a slight uptick in 2020 to 16%, but a very steep decline. So a huge proportion of California workers haven't had the same opportunity that those workers in the 1950s had to negotiate on their behalf in California.
And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? I mean, it's some people would say it's political. You know, a lot of people point to Reagan and the Patco strike, the air traffic controllers, but really it's more than that, right? It's the changing, you know, economy, you know, going from manufacturing to service, for example. You know, the more diverse workforce. It's things that the workplace is changing, and so unions had a bit of a challenge keeping up with that, it seems.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of jobs have been shipped overseas, jobs that were typically union jobs. Unions would say that businesses have gotten better at stopping union
Mhm.
drives, and businesses would say that unions are losing relevancy. And
Yeah,
that,
you know, you often hear that argument that, you know, unions were good in the past, but they're no longer really essential. But you know, when we come back, we're going to talk about the erosion of the middle class. It's become an increasingly worrisome trend. You know, is the decline of unions part of that, the reason for the erosion of the middle class? And if so, could a resurgent labor movement close those gaps, or would more unions impede economic growth and restrict job opportunities? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. So, are unions a good thing or a bad thing? I guess it depends who you ask. We're talking with Jesse Bedayn with CalMatters, an award-winning nonpartisan nonprofit journalism venture committed to explain California politics, how it works, and why it matters. So, Jesse, I wanted to ask you about the decline of unions. Has that contributed to the nation's growing income inequality? And would union membership in the private sector help shrink that wealth gap?
yeah, it's a great question. There aren't many studies on it, but the ones that do exist, one from Princeton in particular, that used new data from the last century, found that the decline of unions contributed to about 10% at least of the wealth gap that we now see in California. And another study found that the decline of unions widened the gap between male workers by 33%, between low and high wage workers, and 20% for women. And that's largely in part because unions, if you imagine the finances in a state as a pie, unions help spread the pie more to the workers than just to the C-suite.
Yeah, Samuel Gompers, one of the founders of the American Federation of Labor, was once asked in front of Congress what unions wanted, and his response was very pithy. It was one word. He said, "More." And I think that really sums it up. They
Right.
want a bigger slice of the pie. It was interesting that the California Future of Work Commission just issued a report, and they said that for low-wage workers, having a union will increase their economic situation by 39%, as opposed to getting a college degree, which would increase it 33%. So you could argue that unions have a bigger impact economically on workers than getting a college degree. You know, I'm just wondering what effect union has though on like issues like job security and safety in the workplace. Do they have a big impact that way?
They do, yeah. Just taking, for example, some hotels during the pandemic um, that are represented by Unite Here, which is a union in part that has a local in San Francisco, and many of those workers were let go at the start of the pandemic, but their union contract stipulated that they needed to be the first ones rehired when the hotel started rehiring. So there's unions really focus on keeping workers at work, even if they have to leave. They get priority for coming back. So it's been a
Right.
huge
See,
influence.
yeah, seniority plays a big role in that, obviously. Unions like seniority because I think it's an objective way as opposed to relying on a manager's subjective opinion. That's what unions would say. The other thing, too, is that there is a difference in termination and discipline. In union situations, right, that's something called just cause. There has to be a good reason. In a non-union situation, the legal standard is what's something called employment at will, which means the employer can do it for a good reason, a bad reason, or no reason at all. So it's a pretty big difference in terms of job security. And in terms of, I think I read in your report that in terms of filing safety complaints, More likely, if you're a union member, more likely that you'll file a complaint with OSHA than if not. I guess maybe some of those non-union workers are worried about retaliation.
Yeah, the union workers don't have to worry about retaliation as much, but also unions offer that support network of I want to file an OSHA complaint, and the union can help a worker to do just that.
Yeah, they do provide that additional protection. But companies would argue that unions just increase costs, impede profits and growth, and they're going to limit opportunities. So, the argument is you don't need unions, and or that unions are a thing of the past. Is that true?
Well, if you have a union that's demanding higher wages and better health care, there's inevitably going to be a cost to it. It's just how bad the cost will be and how much it'll impact the business. And the studies that we have looked at show that there isn't a huge cost, but it does impact, say, job growth by about 4%, for example, and can pull money certainly out of the business's coffers. For small businesses, that's a much bigger concern, and unions tend to avoid very small businesses. But for larger businesses, it doesn't have an enormous impact.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is too, if unions ask for too much, they price themselves out of the market. A good example, Frankie, if you look at retail food, all right, now the self checkouts. To the extent that the wages are too high, the companies are going to look for other ways to automate to save those costs. We've only got about 45 seconds left in this segment, but I want to ask you, you've reported that unions aren't all bad for business. How so?
Yeah, that was my colleague, Grace Bedayn, who did a fantastic job on that. What she found was that unions in some cases, and this was a study coming out of Europe and some examples in California, can actually support communication between the employer and the employees, which can just facilitate a more efficient workplace generally. So that has actually worked in some businesses in California and certainly worked in some businesses in Europe.
Yeah, it's sometimes if you have an internal system, a way to deal with your complaints, you don't file lawsuits. Well, I want to thank Jesse Bedayn with CalMatters for joining us. Up next, unions have long been involved in the political process, sometimes indirectly by advocating for employee legislation, pro-employee legislation, sometimes directly by asking for increased wage and benefits for public sector workers. Should they be active in the political arena? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Some argue that unions' influence subverts the political process. Others argue that unions, like public sector unions, are no different than any other special interest group, like a corporate political action committee. We're talking with Judy Lin, a reporter with CalMatters, who recently co-authored a series of articles on unions in the 21st century. Welcome to the Maddy Report, Judy.
Good to be here.
So I want to ask you, labor unions are a major influence at the state capitol for sure, are spending money primarily to help Democrats, and then when Democrats are elected to get pro-labor legislation. So let's talk about union spending and political activity. What are the numbers?
Yeah, let's start at a really high level. Last year, if you look at the National Institute on Money in State Politics, they poured in about $123 million into local state political campaigns. Now, to break that down a little bit, at the state legislative level, it was 16.3 million. If you look back at some of the proposition, the major fights, Prop 22, when the gig companies like Uber and Lyft and DoorDash put up a lot of money to overturn AB 5,
it was kind of a redefinition of what an employee was, and unions were very involved in that. And you do see that on the propositions. Unions they're always putting a lot of money in these things.
Yes, it's all about political influence. That there's an effort that Art Pulaski, the leader of the California Labor Federation, which is like the umbrella organization, like the Association for Unions.
Right.
He indicated like it's always good to go to a business or a business group and knowing that you've got friends in powerful places. He admits that.
Yeah. He just stepped down. He's going to be replaced, it looks like, by a current assembly member, a person. We'll see if that happens. But organized labor has a big influence at the state capitol. A lot of this legislation that passes through, like the California Teachers Association, they have a big influence.
Absolutely. Their mantra is to empower workers. And so, you see gains in the legislature to provide overtime for farm workers, mandatory paid sick leave, increased parental leave benefits. And look, the biggest one of all so far was the labor's ability to cajole Jerry Brown to go with the $15 hour minimum wage. That was a tremendous win.
Yeah, and then they're always pushing that agenda, for workers. Let me ask you this though: there was a recent decision concerning public sector unions. There was something in the law called fair share that if you were a public employee and a union was representing you, you had to pay your fair. You don't have to join the union, but you had to pay the fair share of that union's work for you. Recently, this more conservative Supreme Court said, no, that's not constitutional. That's a violation of those employees' free speech rights. A lot of people thought, well, that means dues are voluntary, which means that, gosh, unions are going to lose money and they're going to lose influence. Has that happened?
Not at all. The conservative dream to squash out public sector unions did not come to pass here in California. I know some numbers went down in Wisconsin when the governor there did the right to work movement, but here in California, it didn't. It did not come to pass. In fact, events overtook things. I talked about AB 5. The employment status. The labor around 2018-19 was really able to rally around this issue and galvanize gig workers, just as inequality became, front of mind for a lot of people.
Yeah, we'll have about 30 seconds or so left, but I'm going to ask you this. When you survey state and local governments, unions are very active at that level. Which public sector unions are the most effective or seem to have the most clout when it comes to improving members' wages and conditions of employment?
Oh, wow. I would say there's essentially two buckets. There's the public sector unions, think of California Teachers Association, police unions, firefighters. And then there's the bucket of labor unions serving private sector workers. And then there's the mix in between. They all have their strengths. And, right now, SEIU has been making a big play to improve wages and conditions for fast food workers. You're seeing that front and center in 2022.
And you're going to see more of that, I'm sure. Hey, I want to thank Judy Lind for joining us. Up next, what's the future of unions in California? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. To state the obvious, the workplace is changing in many ways. First of all, we've got a more diverse workforce. Secondly, traditional sectors like manufacturing have declined as a result of foreign competition. And third, we have entirely new sectors like app-based gig work and online retail that have grown exponentially. Have unions adapted to this growing and changing economy and changing workforce? Our guest is Grace Getty, a reporter with CalMatters. So, Grace, I want to ask you about, there's a lot of talk about employees and independent contractors. There have been some legal issues around that recently in California. So just to get things straight for folks, what's the difference between an employee and an independent contractor?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. So a lot of legal protections and rights are bundled with full employee status. So things like minimum wage, things like overtime, workers' compensation, health-related benefits, and independent contractors, for the most part, are not entitled to those benefits. They work a little bit differently. They can potentially, do business with several different employers. Generally, they have more flexibility, but they lack this kind of bundle of rights that legal employees are due.
Yeah, I mean, when I try to explain this to students, because I teach a course in employment law, is I say it's A to B. If there's an arrow between A and B, in other words, they're telling you how to get to point B, that's an employee. If there's just, in a week, I want to see you at point B, i.e. the backyard done, that's an independent contractor. It's kind of a simple way, kind of a right to control, simple way to kind of understand the concept. In 2019, the Supreme Court, California Supreme Court, expanded the definition of who qualifies as quote unquote an employee. Later that year, that decision was actually codified into state law, signed by the governor in a bill called AB 5, an infamous bill, just to some. What did the court's decision and the legislature's actions mean in practical terms for California workers?
Yeah, so the court's decision came up with a three-pronged test for who should be considered an employee. And one of the prongs was, is this worker, who is maybe currently an independent contractor, doing work that falls outside of the company's normal business? And that had kind of big implications because, say, if you're a driver for a gig company like Uber, driving is not outside of Uber's normal business, right? So this test, based on how, lawyers and legal academics were understanding it, would have shifted all of these folks who are currently independent contractors into being legal employees.
Yeah, and it's a huge issue, and actually it prompted a lot of the transportation companies, the app companies like Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and Instacart. They're kind of upset by this, so they put Prop 22 on the ballot. They spent $200 million. It's the most anyone's ever spent on a proposition to basically overrule it, change that. Not surprisingly, it won on the ballot. What did Prop 22 do?
Yeah, so Prop 22, basically, after the passing of this law, which you just mentioned, AB 5, kind of potentially turned all these independent contractors into employees. Prop 22 basically carved out that for gig workers and turned them back into independent contractors, and then added a few benefits that they didn't previously have. So gig companies committed to paying drivers, for example, 120% of minimum wage during their quote engaged time when they're actively transporting a passenger. Now, a lot of time drivers are on the road, they're not actively transporting a passenger. They're maybe traveling to go pick someone up or waiting for someone to get to their vehicle. But so
that was a big issue, right? That downtime when they're not being paid was a big issue for these drivers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so they did a few other things to kind of give, it's kind of like independent contractor plus, right? There are a few extra things that they've added on for these special work, kind of a third classification of workers.
Mm-hmm. Right. So there was, I think, accident insurance. I think there was some healthcare subsidies, some new public safety protections that got bundled in with this. And then, they also, in Proposition 22, it was, they added the rule that it would take a 7/8 majority of the legislature.
That's the thing that really wow, that's a super, super majority. Listen, we've only got about 30 seconds left in the segment. I want to ask you this, Prop 22 has already been challenged. One court said it's, unconstitutional. This is an ever-changing legal landscape. What's the future of unions in this new environment?
It's a great question. Yeah, I think both sides, labor and the companies are waiting to see what happens with this court case, and that may change what happens to gig workers in the coming years. Certainly, there have been a lot of, threatened strikes in the past month, contract negotiations. There's certainly a lot happening in labor in California right now. So we'll have to see what the future holds. That's
a good way to end it. I want to thank our guest, Grace Getty with CalMatters, for joining us. If you want to stay up with state and local politics, you can log on to the Maddy website or one of our social platforms to learn more. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Institute. Thanks for joining us. If you want to stay up to date on state and local politics, you can sign up for our free e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.